But this now takes us to our second session, where we will start reflecting on the implications of the Paris Agreement and net zero for the investment treaty regime, moving from human rights, moving from ISDS as a structure, as covered by Roger and Philipp, towards a particular focus on finance. And to do that, we're very fortunate to have an excellent set of speakers. The first three, Professor Jessica Green and Butch Bacani and Philipp Censkowsky, are here to give us some background on why the Paris Agreement is regulating finance flows in the first place and what this has meant for the world of finance and investment insurance. And that will then tee up David Gaukrodger from the OECD, who will present the Secretariat's work linking the finance provision of the Paris Agreement to the world of investment treaties. And I believe all speakers would like to share some slides. And Jessica, if it's okay with you, if we could start with your presentation.
Great, thank you very much. Lauge, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, okay, thank you. I'm gonna just share my screen here. Let's see, give me 2 seconds. And there we are. We should be okay?
Good. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you, Lauge and David, for inviting me thus far. It's been a very fascinating discussion. My name is Jessica Green. I'm a professor of political science, cross-appointed at the School of Environment at the University of Toronto. I come to you as a climate expert, not an investment expert. And so I hope I can indeed provide some useful background to this discussion about the UNFCCC, which is something that I've been working on for about 15 years. So the title of my talk is From Tons to Investment, How Do We Link Climate Change and Investment Treaties? And I'd like to make 3 points really in my brief comments. First, I think that I'd like to argue that we need to shift the frame on global climate policy. And I'm going to make the argument that we need to focus on regulating finance instead of tons of greenhouse gases. I'd like to underscore the point that was made in the previous panel that and by Lauge in his opening comments, that with financing comes responsibility. And we need to think about how investments can indeed be risky climate business. And finally, that just because investments are out of sight, they are not necessarily out of mind. And they can indeed affect domestic climate pledges. So first, let me talk a little bit about the UNFCCC. Since 1992 in the Framework Convention, the UNFCCC approach has been on regulating tons of greenhouse gases, right? How do we account for them? How do we measure them? And how do we trade them? And there are a lot of problems with this approach, which I've set forth in a number of my published works. The first is the obvious one, which is that measuring greenhouse gases is difficult. It's hard to know. We have scientific insights to help us do this, but it is not a straightforward endeavor. This is particularly true when we talk about carbon offsets, because those are basically how much carbon would have been emitted compared to a hypothetical baseline. And so because of these difficulties, measurement and accounting, and therefore trading, are susceptible to gaming. These difficulties give rise to another problem, which is that the political debates in the UNFCCC revert to technical questions about how to measure and trade greenhouse gas emissions. This is very well illustrated by the fact that the very last thing to be concluded in in the Paris Agreement was Article 6 about trading greenhouse gases, and that took years to conclude. In fact, that was just finished at the last COP. So we've focused on that rather than the causes of emissions. And as a result of that, many of the policies that we've been employing to focus on tons, like carbon trading and like net zero, have not moved the needle significantly on decarbonization. And so I've recently done some work showing about the limits of carbon pricing and reducing emissions. In the case of net zero, often it's too soon to tell whether or not we are in fact moving the needle on decarbonization, but there's plenty of published work now that shows why we need to be wary about the robustness of a number of pledges that have been made. Okay, so instead of this problematic focus on tons, I think that we need to focus on how money is regulated and the flow of money through the economy. Obviously, this is where investment treaties come in. The reason for that is because money is causally prior to tons, right? Investment is what causes emissions. Money is obviously much easier to measure and more difficult to gain. Obviously, there are some challenges with offshoring and tax evasion, but in general, compared to the measurement and accounting of greenhouse gases, measuring money is a much more straightforward endeavor. And importantly, it gets to the crux of the political conflicts that underlie climate policy. As we've talked about a little bit in the previous panel, right, money is the concern about decarbonization policy, right? Money is going to change the value of assets, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. So if we focus on money, regulating money instead of tons, right, this is definitely a bigger political lift, right? We don't have to revert to these technical conversations about how to measure greenhouse gases. There's going to be more political conflict, but it has the potential to be a much more powerful political lever on emissions. And just to give you a flavor of that, in 2020, the IMF estimated that fossil fuel subsidies were about 5.9 trillion. That includes indirect subsidies. So we can debate a little bit about the number, but it's a very large one. The 2018 UNEP, UN Environment Program emissions gap report said that phasing out fossil fuel subsidies could reduce emissions by 10% in the next decade, right? And so we talked about how quickly we need to move. The mismatch between the climate crisis and the pace of reform in international institutions. If we want to get a lot of leverage quickly on changing the emissions trajectory, regulating the flow of money in the global environment, in the global economy, is the way to go. So the next issue point that I want to make, as has been raised by a number of the speakers already, is that treaties, we know that treaties help enable investments, and the wrong investments are going to lose value in a decarbonizing world. So as countries and firms ratchet up their climate policies, right, which is required by the Paris Agreement, we know that fossil-based assets are going to lose value, right? So it is simply a risky proposition right now to invest in fossil-based assets, because those capital investments will last on the order of decades. And those are precisely the decades in which we are going to be transforming the entire energy system of the global economy. And we know also that, this is the sort of big question that's pending. Owners are going to try to claim financial losses due to climate policy. We've seen this already. That I think we can expect to continue. And the question is, how long will governments continue to pay the bill? Right. The same question is now happening in the insurance industry, right? When these costs become overwhelming, they will present serious threats to the viability of these international legal regimes. So the final point I want to make was raised by Lauge, but I want to tie it more specifically to the Paris Agreement. Right? We know that investment treaties help structure incentives for foreign investment. So if we move money abroad, this will change the locus of emissions, but obviously it doesn't change their financial origin. So Lauge talked about the fact that we should care about the global policy space more than the national one in terms of global emissions, right? But we also need to think about the domestic implications of foreign investment, right? So if emissions are attached to the state or the investors, which finance those emissions generating activities, that will affect the domestic Paris Pledge. So for example, if country A invests in, if investors in country A invest in activities in country B, those emissions will occur in country B, right? But they will have been funded by investors in country A. And so we can then say that those activities, those emissions, are in part financed, or in part originate in country A, and therefore affect the Paris Pledge of country A, right? So an effective tool for Paris alignment is really to think about how we manage, curtail, select how emissions are financed abroad. So just because we move them to another jurisdiction doesn't mean that they are therefore absent from the domestic jurisdiction which financed them. So I'm going to end hopefully with some good news here. This is all as was highlighted in the previous panel. Like, this is a lot. This is a large political demands in a very short political time frame, or environmental time frame. But I think there is some good news. The flip side of risky investments, right, is that they can generate political incentives for first movers, and that's actually quite important. Forward-looking actors are now divesting and or reinvesting in climate positive assets, right? So renewable energy, for example, both to avoid the future costs of regulation and to avoid the risk of stranded assets, right? So smart actors are looking down the road and making capital investments that take into account this changing global economy. So there's a clear economic and therefore political incentives to act first, right? To get a leg up on competitors and to get a leg up before regulation at the international or domestic level kicks in and requires costly changes. And indeed, my research has shown that that's what actors did when they saw what private firms did when they saw carbon pricing coming down the pipeline, right? They started doing internal pricing, they started doing demonstration projects to figure out how to do this before regulation kicked in. So there are incentives for firms and investors to move more quickly, both to avoid absorbing the cost of regulation all at once and to get a leg up on their competitors. And so investment-driven action can help, but we know political science insights tell us that it has to be driven by government policy, right? Those, the shadow of regulation, the threat of regulation, or actual regulation is in part what drives these first movers to shift their behavior. And so that, again, underscores the need for treaty reforms that was raised in the previous panel. So I think that is my last slide. So I will leave it there. I hope I didn't go too far over time. Thanks again for inviting me and for this really excellent conversation. Thank you. Oh,
thank you,
here
Jessica.
are my references, just so you know.
Thank you, Jessica. This was perfect. I'll hand over to Butch Bacani from UNEP. Butch.
Thanks, Lauge. I'll share my screen as well. Yeah. Can you see that?
Yes, that's perfect. Thanks.
Okay, very good. So I'm Butch Bacani. I lead the largest collaborative initiative between the United Nations and the global insurance industry. So I'm going to talk about our work on net zero, in particular, the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. Before that, just make the point on the financial sector in general and sustainability. The key frameworks and initiatives have basically evolved over the past 2 decades. This is not simply an exercise that happened overnight. So from the Principles for Responsible Investment in 2006 that Kofi Annan endorsed, to the Principles for Sustainable Insurance that Ban Ki-moon endorsed, and the Principles for Responsible Banking that the current UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres endorsed in 2019. So there has been a real evolution that kept with the policy frameworks from Paris Agreement to the SDGs that the financial sector has shaped over the past 2 decades to address sustainability issues such as climate change. Now, when we come to the global insurance industry, our narrative is very simple. We believe that the global insurance industry has 3 roles to play in sustainable development. The role of a risk manager, that means understanding risk. Anything that can be done to assess, prevent, and reduce losses is number 1. Number 2 is the role of a financial shock absorber. Insurance is normally viewed as a way to compensate for losses. However, we have also expanded the role of insurance, the role of an enabler of economic activities. And those economic activities could be unsustainable or sustainable activities. It could lead to greenhouse gas emissions or biodiversity loss or human rights violations. So that's an important point when you're talking about net zero, because insurance has traditionally been associated with compensation for losses that do happen rather than enabling activities. And then the role of institutional investors. Globally, the industry has 36 trillion in assets under management. So the way those capital is deployed would have a telling impact on sustainable development. So in 2012, we created these principles for sustainable insurance that have become the global framework and standard for the global insurance industry in addressing a range of sustainability issues, from climate change, biodiversity loss, to human rights violations as well. And we now have about 200 members representing a third of world premium and 15 trillion in assets. Now, let me focus on climate change. So I think the agenda also touched on the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, which is now basically the gold standard for climate risk disclosure in financial markets around the world. So what we've done, for example, with insurers, is to better understand different climate change scenarios and how this would impact insurance business, whether it's the impact of climate change on assets, the impact on the transition from high carbon to a net zero economy, and even climate-related litigation risks that could be related to the insurance business. However, a lot of the initial work of the TCFD was focused on how financial markets and insurance portfolios could be resilient in light of climate change. Until last year, the TCFD came out with a report that includes portfolio alignment. What does that mean? That means aligning financial portfolios, be it investment, insurance, or lending portfolios, with the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. This really changes the agenda, because we're looking beyond simply making your financial portfolio resilient to climate change to actually using it as a lever to decarbonize the real economy in line with a net zero transition pathway. So that means we need to cut emissions in half by 2030 and bring it to net zero by 2050, so that we can limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. So what have we done with insurers here? In 2019, insurance companies, along with other institutional investors, were convened by the UN to commit their investment portfolios and transition them to net zero emissions by 2050. What does that mean? It means not only committing to a 2050 net zero agenda, it means setting science-based targets every 5 years in line with what governments have to do under the Paris Agreement. So this is the private sector equivalent of ambition. If governments have to, under the Paris Agreement, have nationally determined contributions, then financial actors, including insurers, can also set their own targets and show interim targets every 5 years to show that they are on a pathway to net zero. Because anyone can say we're net zero by 2050. If you're able to show science-based net zero targets every 5 years for your portfolios and show that you are on your way to achieving that, there's a lot of credibility and accountability in that exercise. So what we have done is push the agenda further. What about the insurance portfolio of insurance companies? Insurers are both investors and insurers. We want to make sure that both sides of the balance sheet are aligned with the net zero agenda. So last year at the G20 Climate Summit, we launched a Net Zero Insurance Alliance. What does this mean? That means insurance companies, we know that they have emissions associated with their offices or their use of energy, but the largest chunk of emissions from an insurance company are the emissions associated with the company's assets and activities within its insurance and reinsurance underwriting portfolios. And this is the crux of the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. How can you, as an insurance company, make sure that your insurance portfolio is actually in line with the net zero 1.5 degree net zero transition pathway? And can you show and set targets every 5 years that will show how you're making progress and credibility around those targets that you've set. Um, so what does net zero insurance mean? We created this term, but what we're now trying to explain and shape is how can you achieve net zero in insurance portfolios. There are different ways for an insurance company to do that. You can set underwriting criteria. Many of the founding members of the Net Zero Insurance Alliance already have a exclusion policy on fossil fuels, be it on coal or on oil and gas. But that's only one way to do it. Another way is if you're an insurance company, how can you engage with your corporate and retail clients on their decarbonization pathways? Just like as an investor, if you engage with investing companies, how can you actually support them in their decarbonization pathway? Then if you can finance the transition through renewables and all the clean technologies, you can also insure those technologies that will bring us to net zero. Something very specific to insurance is claims management. So every day there's millions of claims out there. If you build back greener, if you repair instead of replace parts, that will also help reduce emissions. So there are different levers for an insurance company to achieve net zero in its insurance portfolio. And just like any other sector, it can engage with policymakers for a science-based and just transition to net zero. However, the big thing that we are doing right now, and it's very core to the concept of net zero insurance, is that all the work around finance emissions or emissions attributable to financial portfolios, all the work that has happened over the past few years have been focused on investment and lending. There is no accounting standard on how emissions could be attributed to insurance contracts. And this is what we're doing right now. This year, we will create a global standard that will help measure how emissions could be attributed to insurance contracts. That will happen by Q4 this year. So that's one of the key milestones, but even that is an accounting exercise. The key part for us that will happen next is by January 2023, we will have a target setting protocol that will then be used by insurance companies who are part of the alliance to set 5-year science-based targets that will help them decarbonize their insurance portfolios in line with a 1.5 net zero transition pathway. And then for them to publish reports every year to show their progress. For the insurers behind the alliance, there are many of the leading global players. We have already tripled our membership from 8 to 24, and the current insurers already represent around 12% of global world premium volume, and we should be likely be closer to 20% by the end of this year. So there's going to be more momentum behind this agenda. We're going to be also involving brokers who are part and insurance associations around the world because they need to be part of this agenda. The Net Zero Insurance Alliance is also part of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero that was really had a big role in COP26. It comes together with the Net Zero Banking Alliance and all the alliances related to investment because the basic agenda is that every professional financial decision has to take net zero into account. So the plumbing and the infrastructure for the financial system has to be oriented towards net zero. If you want to understand more about what net zero insurance is all about, we just produced a white paper last month that will help folks who know net zero but don't know insurance, or who know insurance but don't know net zero, what this agenda is all about. If we go back to our master narrative earlier on, here's what the UN is doing with the global insurance industry. Net zero is part of it, obviously on insurance and investment, but there's a wider ESG debate, there's adaptation and resilience, there's the SDGs, there's biodiversity loss. All of that are part of our agenda. 2 points that I wanted to end with is that I think the key point that I wanted to share with you is that the role of insurance has now evolved from simply being a financial shock absorber to that of an enabler. And that means we can use insurance now to also internalize negative externalities such as greenhouse gas emissions. Secondly, is that where finance goes, so does emissions or emissions reductions. So be it investment, insurance, or lending, because that underpins the real economy. Where financing goes, that's where emissions or emissions reductions will go. So I think putting that in the context of investment treaties and the work of the OECD is going to be really powerful in terms of assimilating the net zero insurance and finance agenda that is happening right in front of us right now.
Thank you so much, Butch. And this was fascinating. And of course, to the extent that investment treaties can be regarded as functionally equivalent to political risk insurance, it's important to understand a lot of the work that you're doing, thinking about insurance as an enabler of certain types of economic activity. And with that, I'll hand over to Philipp from Perspectives Climate Group, who will take us further down that rabbit hole.
Great, yes, will do. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Great. So yes, thanks a lot for having me. My name is Philipp Censkowsky. I'm a researcher and consultant with Perspectives Climate Group, where we work on aligning finance with the 1.5 degree objective, with a focus on export credit agencies. I'll come to that in a bit. And it's my pleasure to talk you through a bit of what it means to align finance flows with the 1.5 degree objective, and of sharing some experiences and best practices from the export finance system. So just briefly the agenda. So I'll briefly give you the main elements of the role of finance in the Paris Agreement and what it means to align with 1.5 degrees. And then pitch that analogy between export credit agencies and investment treaties, and share that experience from the export finance community before I end with providing a short outlook on avenues for reform in the investment treaty community. So just very briefly, the role of finance in the Paris Agreement is mainly given in the Article 9, which is basically the provision of financial support by industrialized countries to the global south through climate finance, and the Article 2.1c, which we've already heard today. It's once more down here on the right. It makes sense to generally divide finance flows in public and private finance flows. I've very simply schematically put an overview here. And I want to highlight at this point this special importance of public finance and public instruments that promote export and investments, and thus steer private finance flows through de-risking, through crowding in public and private finance, etc. pp, because it's governments that have signed the Paris Agreement that basically mandate or mandate public finance institutions such as multilateral development banks, bilateral development banks, export credit agencies, and so forth. And they have signed the Paris Agreement, so they have special obligations for really being a front runner. So what does it mean to align finance flows with 1.5 degrees? Maybe I take you a step back here, but maybe that's not bad, especially given now the latest publications of the IPCC and what we've heard today from the WMO. So meeting the 1.5 degree goal, there's a scientific consensus that that means with a 50% probability by the end of the century, we only have about 500 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents left as a global carbon budget. And so to just put that into context, that's the amount of emissions that the world has emitted between 2010 and today, more or less. And this is what we've left for the next 78 years. So this really means we have to have global emissions and reverse the current trend of increasing emissions and get to really genuine net zero by 2050. And on, let's say, from the physical side, because we talk about physical quantities, right, of carbon dioxide emissions, we have to leave 60% of today's proven oil and fossil gas reserves in the ground and nearly 90% of proven coal reserves. And the IPCC has recently highlighted that still the big problem is that public and private finance flows into fossil fuel value chains are still continued to be bigger than those flows into climate adaptation and mitigation activities. So really there's this need to withdraw misaligned finance and public support and redirect it to sustainable activities. As many have said already, we really don't have the time anymore to build a green economy on top of a brown one and call it a success. And this has even by the International Energy Agency, which has traditionally been more on the conservative side, so to say, been emphasized last year in their roadmap for the global energy sector, that to satisfy the projected energy demand in a net zero scenario until 2050, we simply don't need new coal, oil, and gas supply anymore. And this has given a variety of stakeholders in civil society and in research new arguments to really say, okay, in line with the IEA projections as of the 31st of December 2022, no new supply of coal, oil, and gas should be approved and financed. And so now to ECAs and investment treaties, to this analogy. So why do we look at these two? Because we think, as Lauge has already alluded to, that they are functionally similar. So both de-risk foreign investment. Export credit agencies are either private agencies with an official mandate or public agencies themselves that promote exporters. They provide loans, guarantees, insurance schemes, and in return they receive a premium or interest payment. Which in a sense then is a transaction-specific de-risking capacity, whereas, as many of you will know, investment treaties are more generic legal instruments between states that protect investors in the treaty's ambit and are kind of a quasi-public good for an investor that him or herself doesn't have an obligation under that instrument, and also mitigates political or other risks. And yeah, as we talk about investment treaties in the context of climate change, this is notably the risk here of climate policy, of transitional risks. And one more element is that both share a problem, namely that export credit agencies have in the past been the largest class of public finance institutions in supporting the fossil energy sector with an average of 40 billion per year. And investment treaties, as many of you know, have this possibility that investors do arbitration claims. And just to give you a short overview of the numbers, just for primary resource extraction in the past, up until so far, we've had about 244 billion US dollars of compensation payments that have been paid by states to investors. And the study that Lauge has alluded to, that has been published last week in Science, projects that up to 340 billion US dollars would be paid if countries decided to follow the International Energy's net zero scenario, that meaning thereby to cancel all new upstream oil, gas, and coal projects after 2022 that have not yet been approved yet. I can highly recommend reading this new study. But now going back to the export finance system and maybe also what to learn from it. So in the past year, we've really seen a very strong political momentum. We have the Export Finance for Future initiative, 7 countries that have rallied together with the objective of meeting the Paris climate goals. We've seen a reform of the OECD arrangement, which is the main supranational regulatory framework of officially supported export finance, where they have banned official export credit support for unabated coal-fired power plants. We're still working on getting a similar prohibition clause or restrictions for oil and gas, but that has been a major step forward. And then the momentum last year has culminated in the COP26 statement on international public support for the clean energy transition, where 30+ countries have committed to end new international public finance for fossil fuels. which, as we've seen, then mostly concerns export credit agencies, also the other public finance institutions that are active internationally. But that has been a major leap and has countries on board like Canada, like the US, like Germany. So that was really great. But also from the institutions themselves, we see proactiveness. For instance, the British ECA is the first one to implement actually phasing out their support for fossil, most of their support for fossil fuel projects, or the Dutch ECA developed a methodology to really measure the entirety of its exposure to fossil fuel value chains, which includes upstream, so exploration, extraction, transport, midstream processing, etc., PP downstream, which is then power or other combustion uses of fossil fuels, and really has pioneered in that sense. So what can we take from that 4 investment treaties? Where will they go? I have already been very delighted by the discussion and look forward to hearing more. Just some few ideas that from our point of view would be pertinent for investment treaties, some desirable outcomes. So first of all, that future arbitration claims from misaligned sectors are prevented. So basically this carbon carve-out for economic activities that are no longer in line with societal goals around the world. So that would be no coverage for new upstream coal, oil, and natural gas supply projects. But then also a step further, because these are public instruments and there are special responsibilities to deal with them. So really also to limit the coverage also for mid and downstream phases of the fossil fuel value chain that indirectly spur demand for fossil fuel production. And then once this is achieved, what would be really desirable to have is a conditionality of cover that requires a minimum ambition for organizational, for corporate or financial net zero targets for the remaining set of investors or counterparts of an investment treaty, which includes a minimum ambition of front-loaded emission reductions, comprehensive approach to counting emission reductions, including the scope 3. So UNEP is doing great work. There's the race to the bottom by the UN, etc. pp. But also the cautious use of carbon dioxide removal technologies, because it is tied to date still to a significant degree of uncertainty that leads the research community to think, okay, yes, but under a certain precaution. And then what we would really like to see is that these coalitions of the willing of front-running countries be emulated and to create a similar political momentum working towards a Paris-aligned level playing field for transboundary investments. And I will end just with a question, which is basically about the possible avenues for reform of investment treaties in the context of climate change. One may be the abolitionist approach in a sense of terminating existing treaties despite, for instance, the legal problems of sunset clauses and finding a workaround them, or the reformist approach that may be time-consuming, as experience tells, and also ineffective, but may be more politically workable. So I'm really happy to discuss with you about these questions. And yeah, with that, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Philipp. That was very helpful. So we are now through the first 3 steps of our 4-step rocket. And I will, with that, hand over to David, who will try and tie all these elements and strings back to the world of investment treaties. David from the OECD Secretariat, the virtual floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Lauge, and good afternoon, evening, and morning to everyone. I'll try to share my screen as well here. You can see the screen? Okay, great. So the Paris Agreement is perhaps the most important collective government action to date on the climate. And efforts to achieve the Paris Agreement, to align with Paris, are at the core of climate action by governments, business, and civil society. So a key question for investment treaties is, what does Paris alignment mean for investment protection? And I'm going to focus on Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement. It sets out the aim to make finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. So it has two elements, a focus on finance flows and the aim to align those finance flows with low emissions, which today generally means net zero. Article 2.1c is not a minor provision of the Paris Agreement. It sits at the same level as Article 2.1a, which sets out the temperature goals. So alignment of finance flows is at the core of the Paris Agreement. Analysis of finance flow alignment under Article 2.1c is new for investment treaties. But as we've heard today, it's really about joining an immense body of work on Paris alignment of finance. That work has been constantly extending further, as we heard from Butch, from Philipp, and from Jessica. And it's extending fast. And the multiple close connections between investment treaties and finance flows make them an important area for action under Article 2.1c. The basic thrust of work on finance and the climate is pretty straightforward. If you finance it and it produces emissions, you own part of those emissions. That's really the core of what I'll say. If you finance it and it produces emissions, you own part of those emissions. There's lots of work on how to measure and other issues, but the basic principle is pretty simple. You finance them, you own them. And insurance is recognized as a part of finance right from the outset of the work on the task force on climate financial disclosures. Once you recognize that you own your financed emissions, you count them, you disclose information about them, you make commitments to reduce them to align with Paris, you report on your progress. We'll look at some of the detail, but the basic principles are fairly straightforward. And the basic principles are out there. I can go on the internet and I can find climate policy from a large insurance company, AXA. I can find the climate change strategy from UK Export Finance. These are not two-page pamphlets. They are 20 or 80 pages of analysis, commitments, and reports on progress. Whether a major company will adopt or strengthen its climate policy in response to shareholder pressure is front-page business news. Let me be a bit provocative. I can find a climate policy for AXA, but not for any government investment treaties. I can find one for UK Export Finance, but not for any government investment treaty. I don't need to single anyone out. I don't think anyone has a climate policy, public climate policy for their investment treaty. So there's a big gap. And a big gap is also a big opportunity. There's a role for government champions on investment protection, finance flows, and the climate. So here's the outline for the balance of my presentation. I'll briefly note a few key concepts and fast accelerating development in work on the Paris Agreement and finance flows, and then turn to investment treaties and Paris alignment. There are some important concepts that merit attention. The first is financed emissions. So the emissions associated with a given provision of financial services to an entity are frequently referred to as financed emissions. So if a bank extends a loan to an oil company that produces a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions, the financed emissions of the bank include a fraction of the emissions of the oil company. A second key concept for financial actors is their portfolio of counterparties. The counterparties here are the recipients of the financial services, the company that receives the loan, or the insured company. And the portfolio of a financial actor is the set of its counterparties. We'll come to investment treaties, but note that from this finance flows perspective, when we talk about treaty counterparties, we're talking about the covered investors. The counterparties are the entities benefiting from treaty protection. They're not the governments. There is an expanding range, as I mentioned, of committed financial actors. Attitudes have changed from "it's not my problem" to "I'm actively driving solutions." Banks a few years ago saw themselves as essentially having no emissions, or only emissions limited to their own operational activities. That has changed today. The recognition they are responsible for their financed emissions is now widespread. I can't possibly cover the scope of work. I'm still learning about it, and we have others today who know far more about it than I do. But I've listed some of the key players on this slide. I encourage you to follow up on what these public and private organizations are doing and to compare with your own area. So here's a quick sense of what net zero action looks like. What does it mean to commit and move on net zero? Here, this is taken from the Race to Zero criteria developed by the UN, but I think it has broader relevance. It's a recent establishment of key criteria. So it starts with a pledge. And I think in a government context, you would need a high level commitment to reach net zero. Then a plan explaining what steps will be taken to achieving net zero, especially in the short and medium term. We've heard today, obviously, about the urgency, setting an interim target to achieve over this decade, then proceeding, taking immediate action to achieving net zero, consistent with the interim targets, and then publishing. So committing to report publicly on your progress, and that incorporates the science elements that Butch mentioned and Philipp. So let's turn to investment treaties. Investment treaties directly address and promote finance flows. Treaty covered investors, the counterparties, are frequently financial investors. Shareholders are covered, lenders are covered. More broadly, international transfers of capital are the trigger for the application of investment treaty provisions, and all such transfers involve finance flows. And the evolution of ISDS has generated its own set of finance flows. Investment treaty coverage is currently unaligned with emissions and often includes finance flows associated with high carbon activities. Over 100 ISDS cases and 7 of the top 10 damages awards, all for over $1 billion US, involve fossil fuel interests. If we turn to investment treaties and insured emissions, I mentioned the notion of financed emissions, and insured emissions are an important category of financed emissions. And we heard from Butch on what's happening at the cutting edge of work in that area. Insured emissions are the emissions associated with a portfolio of insured entities. And we see that this responsibility in this area is being recognized. And if I look, for example, at the UK Export Finance climate change strategy, I can read them recognizing that, quote, "Our biggest greenhouse gas emissions impact is from our scope 3 emissions, which are the emissions produced from the support we provide to our lending, guarantees, and insurance products. We collectively refer to these as our portfolio emissions." So, and they go on to note that they can reduce those by reducing their exposure to high carbon sectors and supporting more low carbon and ensuring that emissions are minimized in projects that they support. So you can see that the recognition of responsibility in this area is increasingly clear, both in the public and private sector. The notion of insured emissions is particularly relevant for investment treaties because they're often seen as a form of insurance. Once ISDS is available, the fundamental structure of insurance is there. You have an insured entity, you have identified risks, and you have financial payment upon occurrence of the risk. The OECD definition of insurance is an activity intended to provide individual institutional units exposed to certain risks with financial protection against the consequences of the occurrence of specified events. So it's very similar to the basic functional definition of insurance. I think it's worth emphasizing, because much of the debate on investment treaties has been about reforms to address the policy space, and there's been much less attention to the scope of covered investment, that the issue of Paris alignment of finance flows is distinct from government policy space issues. As I mentioned, net zero alignment of finance flows targets a climate alignment of counterparties in portfolios. The idea is to use leverage to push the green transition by business counterparties. What investments are you covering? What investments are you insuring? Climate policy space is obviously vital, but it's not sufficient to align finance flows. So in conclusion, the lessons from work on finance flows and Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement are essentially that you own today the emissions that you finance, and finance includes insurance. Once you recognize that you own them, you count them, disclose, commit to net zero and interim targets, and report, or you pledge, plan, proceed, and publish. You own your own treaties, so you may need to address your own treaties. But the investment treaty system is global, and so is the climate. So I'll just mention briefly in closing this element. Each government today has policy interests in all 2,500 investment treaties. Any treaty that ensures high carbon activities is a concern for everyone. Any treaty that over-deters government climate action is a problem for everyone. And any treaty interpretation that over-deters government climate action is a problem for everyone. So I think there's an opportunity here to work together. There's a gap between investment treaties and other public and private actors on finance flows. I think that gap is an opportunity, and we look forward to working with you in our efforts to address the gap and achieve the reduction of emissions that we're seeking. Thank you very much.